Okay, so 5 keys for home buying. The first one that I really want to highlight as we kind of step into this, and again, at any point, our next finance class, if we want to actually get into the details about how to afford a home as opposed to renting an apartment or a home and how to get to a home, I'm happy to cover that. But that's a own class in unto itself. It's about budgets and sacrifices. But I have the 5 steps to that too, so we can dig into it. But for right now, this is specifically around the idea of home buying and really motivating everybody into not only wanting to buy a home and get out of renting, but more importantly, how to get into the right home and then leverage that to get into even the righter home. But step one, and the first thing that I want to kind of press upon everybody is you have to pick the right neighborhood, because you're buying the home for you, but you're really buying it for the next owner. And I'm 40 years old. I have very modest desires in life, and yet I've already lived in 3 homes. And every time we get a home, we always think this is our forever home, right? Or this is the home we're going to be in. And then life changes. For my wife and I, for example, our first home we bought when we didn't think we would be able to have children. And so, we then eventually were fortunate enough through fertility treatments to be able to have kids. And all of a sudden, what we wanted in our first home evolved overnight. And then we got into another home. And so if you get a home and you think it checks all of your boxes, but you're only looking at your boxes, you can really limit your potential to leverage this home as an asset once you eventually leave the home. So what we want to do is we want to get into the right home for us with consideration that the right home for us is also the right home for the next owner. And so really you got to look outside of your own kind of situation. If I had had the foresight, right, I wouldn't have gotten our first home so specific to just me and my wife because I thought we weren't going to have kids. And so when we got the home, we really got a home that met our 2 needs. We didn't consider schools. We didn't consider the actual structure of the home. Was it hardy board? Was it brick? Was it in a neighborhood with big trees, or was it in a neighborhood where they leveled everything and there's no trees? None of those things essentially mattered to us, but when we went to resell it, it mattered to who we were trying to resell it to. And if it matters to more people that you're going to sell it to, then you get a higher price. You get to leverage more equity out of your home to then convert into your next home. So when you're first and foremost looking at homes, whether you have children or not, you better look at the schools. If you have kids, you're going to look at schools organically. If you don't have kids, schools still matter. And that's one thing that I see a lot of us fall into kind of that trap. I fell into that trap. A lot of us fall into the trap. We think it doesn't really matter what the schools are. And if you don't have kids, or your kids are already grown up, or you're never going to have kids, the school still matters, because if you sell that house, the person or the people potentially buying it care about the schools. My parents and I live in the same neighborhood. We live 17 doors down from each other. I go to, my house goes to 3 schools, Baranoff, Bailey, and Bowie. My parents' house goes to 3 schools, Manchac, Paredes, and Aikens, right? 17 doors down from each other. My parents have 2,000 more square feet than we do in our home. We live in a 1,500 square foot home. They live in a 3,200 square foot home. My home is currently valued more than theirs, purely because of the schools. 17 doors down, essentially the same neighborhood. They have almost 2,000 square feet more than us, and our house is more valuable than theirs. And so when you're looking into buying a home, you've got to consider who's going to buy it next, because then you can leverage it as an asset. That also means, first and foremost, or when you're considering that, then you have to look at step 2, and this is the Goldilocks kind of price.
Hey, Tim. Somebody
Yes.
had a question really quick. Blake asked, would the same neighborhood rules apply for condos?
Yes. I think so. I mean, look, condos probably fall into a 1B type of a subset because it is a condo. But the area that you're around, if the school districts are good, the houses around it are going to tend to be of a higher value, right? Typically, higher value homes get treated better. They're built to last longer, right? The neighborhood stays or ages much better. And so your condo then, regardless of whether condos are typically bought by people with children or not, anyone looking for a condo is going to want to be in the center of a nice neighborhood that's aging well and not center of a mediocre neighborhood that's aging badly. And we've all seen it, and we probably all live in it, and I've lived in it, right? Like, I look back, my wife and I lived in an apartment for 4 years when we first got married, and like, I can't believe we did that. It's so frustrating to me looking back at how we could have built equity and leverage in an asset as opposed to essentially renting an apartment. But the apartment was easy, kind of met our needs, right? But then we moved into a home, and there are some condos in this neighborhood. The condos, because they're in the neighborhood, even though they're condos, they may not be growing as fastly in their value as like a home, but they're still going to grow in value in correlation to the neighborhood or into their surroundings. So I think schools still play a huge part. If you're in a condo, if you're going to own something, you want to be in a place that's going to age well and appreciate well, as opposed to maybe something even bigger or nicer, but that will age poorly and depreciate quickly, or not appreciate as quickly. Like, it's Austin. Anything you buy right now is going to appreciate. But there are homes, even here close to the office, for example, that are either in Del Valle schools or similar like AISD schools with low gradings, 3s, 4s. You can see this anytime you look for a home. And it's the type of neighborhood where they just level the whole area, and then they plant 1 or 2 trees right in front of each house. Like, everybody here has either driven through a neighborhood like that, may even live in a neighborhood like that. And what happens a lot of times in neighborhoods like that is you can get much more square footage at a much lower price. And so it becomes very tempting to step into that. Again, that's probably, and may eventually be, in your unique individual scenario, may be the best situation for you. However, if you can step it off, and this is the highlight of it, is if you can get into 1,000 or even 1,500 less square feet, but put yourself into a better neighborhood, that house might only meet your needs for a few years, but it's going to appreciate at a substantially faster rate than the other house. And then you can leverage that appreciation and additional equity to then get into a bigger home in the same nice neighborhood, or in whatever nice neighborhood you're looking for. So it's looking at your house as an asset, and not purely as how is this checking my boxes? It's how is it going to check the next buyer's boxes? And therefore my asset can appreciate at a faster rate versus at a slower rate. So I would look at that from a condo perspective or a home perspective, anything you're going to own. I hope that answered your question. Any other questions, Shelby?
Not at this time. That was it.
Okay. Goldilocks price. Step 2, Goldilocks price. Pick something that you can afford and that is affordable. Big difference there, right? Like, there's a risk that we all take, right? Where we get confused between need and desire. And this is something that, I'll cover when we do the budget conversations, but those 2 words are amazingly important. And we all have to do a good job in order to be financially independent, have financially sound decisions. We have to be able to truly understand the difference between need and desire. my parents live in a bigger home than I do. We live in 1,500 square feet home, which is not big by any means. And there's times where we feel very much, on top of each other. For me, that's kind of nice because then I just kick my kids outside and I'm like, go play outside. That's what y'all should be doing anyways. So big win in that regard. But really, like, if you're getting into your first home or you're getting into your second home, there's always a risk that you make decisions based on what you can afford as opposed to what's affordable. And so you may then step into a home that you can afford, but that stretches you. It stretches you financially, but it gets that extra living room, that second living room that you felt you needed to have when really you don't need a second living room, right? Worst case is oftentimes people will then go buy homes in neighborhoods that are in bad schools or that are not going to appreciate very well because that home offers a third car garage or, a backyard that maybe is a third of the bit larger. Whereas those kind of elements that you may look at as a need to have based on your financial situation and trying to make sure the decision is affordable as opposed to a decision that you can afford. If the decision is affordable, then you step into it and there's certain desires that you sacrifice. You make sure all your needs are met, right? But you essentially pass your desires on. You do this for two reasons. One, anyone here who's ever bought a house knows that the initial purchase of the house is only the first expense. Buying a home is very expensive because then you have to fill the home. I don't know why we do this as Americans, but this is very natural. Whatever square footage you get in your home, you're going to fill it. Doesn't matter. However big or little it is, it will get filled. I assure you. You can buy a 9,000 square foot home and you could be like, I'll never fill this. 5 years later, every room has something in it and you bought 12 couches when you only sit on one. Like this is a problem because now you're in essence utilizing your free cash flow to additional or add-on expenses of a home with elements of the home that are really desired and not needed. That money, instead of buying the fifth couch, could very well go into your retirement 401k. It could go into savings. It could go into a trip to Cancun. And I'll tell you, a third car garage is nice, but Cancun is nicer. Like that's just the reality of it. And so you have to make a decision when it comes to the price of your house that you shouldn't make any decisions based on what you can afford. That is not your decision. It's what is affordable, right? And affordable is very different than what you can afford. And if you've ever bought a new car, just think of a house as like a new car. You walk onto the new car lot. This happens every time you walk onto the new car lot. And I'll get some amens out of y'all because I can assure you, you've all heard this from a sales rep. What monthly can you afford? No, what car? They don't ask you what car total price is affordable or where you get your best bang for your buck. The question is, what monthly payment can you afford? And that's where we get into our trouble. And we typically may buy a car that's maybe nicer than we really need it. We can afford it, but now we have to sacrifice other things that can matter or even give greater sense of happiness in our lives, right? So we should never make a decision based on what we can afford. We should always make decisions based on what is affordable. So assessing what you need versus what you want, right? And then recognizing that the purchase of the home is only your first expense. It is only going to get more expensive. And I'm not even talking about like the major expenses, like eventually the roof's gonna need fixed. Eventually your AC is gonna need to get fixed, and that's $7 grand. I'm just talking about picture frames on the wall. You get hardwood and then you throw a rug on it, which means you're carpeting your hardwood. There's always more expenses. And so if you essentially purchase a home that you can afford but stretches you thin, you're gonna now start to have to leverage debt, or sacrifice things that really matter in your life so that you can fill up your home, right? The second element of that, right, is afford and affordable, is oftentimes we will buy a home in an area that is not going to value at the same rate because that home's a little bit bigger, or it offers some of those amenities that we feel or we think are needs when really they're just desires. Now, the problem with that is not today. You move into that home, maybe it's a brand new neighborhood, the fences are all up, everything's looking good, right? That home, however, in 4 or 5 years, as you try to move out of it, it may very well go from 300 to 390, and you think, my house went up by 90K. That's awesome. That's fantastic equity, and I can leverage that in my other home. However, for the same 300 or 350K, right, you can go to a neighborhood with great schools, with trees, 3-sided brick with maybe siding on the back. And instead of 300 going to 390 in 4 or 5 years, 300 is going to go to 450, 480. Now you have not 90K in equity rolled out, you have 180K in equity, which now is going to pay huge dividends later on. And so I'll get into that in step 4, but being able to leverage that equity into your next buy makes your next buy cheaper, which means you can get more if you want more, or it's just cheaper and now you get to keep more in your pocket if you want more. But this is an asset. You've got to assess how this asset's going to appreciate. No one would buy a stock, right, just because it's cheaper if that stock's not going to do anything over the next 5 years. You're happily going to buy maybe a little bit more expensive of a stock, right, if you know that that stock's going to go up over the next 5 years. And so the house is an asset as much as it is amazing, and walking somebody across the threshold of a new home is always just this like really cool binding moment, right? That house is probably not going to be your house in 5 years. So you need to look at it as much as a joy as an asset. And you have to be able to leverage that asset to then improve the next, steps in your financial life. And so that's where you got to look for the right price, making sure it's affordable. Don't ever ask yourself if you can afford it. Make sure that it's affordable. And then cutting off some amenities or some square footage to get into a home in the right kind of a neighborhood, right? This is where you get into the right price. This is where you get into the right situation where now your asset appreciates at a much, faster rate. Shelby, any questions on that?
Does not sound like it. One just came in. What are some easy value adds for the house itself that would be good to look into that won't constitute a superfluous expense?
That's a good question. Some of that is going to depend on the neighborhood that you're in. But if you're looking at kind of initial expenses in a home, spending a little bit more to get into rock homes, rock neighborhoods always appreciate faster. They always age much better. Siding homes, you can get into more square footage at a cheaper rate, but a siding neighborhood 10 years from now is going to look really beat up. Whereas a rock neighborhood 10 years from now actually looks really pretty. So it ages much better, which means it appreciates, much quicker. So there's some expenses in that regard up front where you really want to kind of look at maybe an extra 10 or 20K to get rock as opposed to siding is hugely valuable. But just by way of your own home, kitchens are always, a big draw, and flooring is always a big draw. I've never put in a pool for resale value. You're never going to get that kind of money that you put into the pool out of it. So always better to buy a pool than to build a pool in that kind of regard. So if you really want a pool, leverage your house for a year or two, save your monies. Don't build a pool at your house. Sell your house, leverage the equity out of it, and go buy a home that already has a pool. Because if it costs you $100K to put a pool in, right? Typically that's going to raise the value of your house about $70,000 to $80,000. So you're going to lose $20,000 to $30,000 on that build. So you might as well go buy somebody's pool and let them lose the money as opposed to you losing it. Kitchens though, opening up kitchens, making for more of an open feel, always big. And then the flooring, you know, I love carpet, so this drives me nuts, but everybody loves hardwood, or like a faux hardwood. And then they like to put rugs on top of it, which is essentially carpet. If anybody wants to help me understand that concept. Everybody hates carpet, but then they put a rug on top of their hardwood floor. Check that. But anything you can do from a flooring perspective, but really the kitchen should be a big focal point. The kitchen, making sure that it's open, usable, updated, upgraded. If you're going to put some money into a house to try to get some return, kitchen's a great first place. And then master bedrooms, right? Like you think about essentially common areas, kitchens, and then master bedrooms. The people who are making the decisions on the purchases, you're going to want to put your money into the areas that they're going to spend their time.
Awesome. We had 2 more come through.
Sure.
So Veronica asked, are the possibilities for extreme weather events taken into consideration for value of a home?
Not really. I mean, floodplain is really the only thing that in Texas or in Austin that we deal with, but it's pretty rare that you're going to step into a floodplain unless you're out in like the Del Valley area. If you go to the Del Valley area or through Shoal Creek type of zones, you can get houses or yards that are in floodplains. A lot of times those are 50-year or 100-year floodplains, and there's insurance, and it's not going to scare off every buyer, but it is going to scare off a portion of the buyers. And anytime you scare off a portion of the buyers, you scare off a portion of the market, right? And the market goes up as supply diminishes and demand increases, and not vice versa. So anytime you lose some level of demand, you can have, you know, a negative impact on overall, you know, benefit. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We're very fortunate in Austin or in the Texas area. We don't get into a lot of those issues. Really, floodplain is the one issue. And if I were buying a home, I'd probably be pretty cognizant to not get in a neighborhood that is floodplain, unless, again, that's the biggest draw of the house. Maybe it's backs up to a dry creek, and the dry creek has a little bit of a floodplain, but the creek is a draw to the home. Then you have to just kind of weigh out your risk and reward. If we were in California or somewhere like that, I'd probably have a whole different conversation. But we're in Texas, great state of Texas. Really, floodplain is the only thing you got to worry about. And it's legally obligated. So if you're ever looking at a house, you can find the FEMA floodplain. It's typically there on like your Redfin apps, anyways. But that's always something that you should be aware of.
Awesome. And then Kevin Gandy asked, do you recommend purchasing a smaller first home so that you can use it as a rental property later?
I mean, anytime you can keep your first home and go to your second home and see that it's financially conducive, I think it's great. I think there's big value, especially if that's something you want to get into, right? Like having renters in a home, like, is a whole nother problem, and there's risk reward associated with that. And that's something you personally need to decide. But especially in the Austin area, home prices continue to go up. I think it's a great asset to have. It's not the only asset you should have, or maybe even an asset that you have to have. But if it is one that you've got a good renter in there, and you can keep that house stepping into your next house, then I think that's a good consideration. But Kevin, Chris, I'll also show on step 4 here the idea of how much you can save by leveraging the equity from one house to the next house to the next house. So looking at what you could potentially save or gain in that regard, you may want to consider that against, you know, the cost or the exposure that you would have in keeping the first house and getting a renter on it. I personally am really bad at fixing anything. My wife would be the first to tell you I'm not good at it, and I have like zero desire to be good at it. And so, you know, having a rental property where inevitably, if you have a home, the one thing you need to know, like I said, is buying the home is the first expense. Everything's going to break in this house at one point or another. And if you have a renter in your home, they ain't treating your home as good as you treat your home. Nobody treats something that they rent as good as something they own. That's life, right? If you've ever driven a rental car, you know that's the truth. right? And so your renters are going to be hard on your home, and there's always going to be work to be done there. There's always going to be additional expenses. So you know, if it's something that you enjoy, or if you can get enough income out of the rental property to offset the risk, then I think it's a great investment. And there's a lot of people who speak very avidly about having, you know, income property. So if you can, and it makes financial sense, and it's something that you enjoy, I would say, you know, all in, go keep it, and, you know, get as many financial, you know, income homes as you can.
There were a couple questions about HOAs. Do you want to address those now, or you want to hold off on those?
This is what I think about HOAs. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Yeah.
So one, Eddie Very Papa asked thoughts on HOAs and master plan communities within the Austin city limits. I guess
Yeah.
that addressed that one.
So look, everything has its pros and cons in life. And so I don't ever try to speak to the extremes. HOAs for a lot of neighborhoods serves a purpose, and the goal of it is to keep the neighborhood appreciating appropriately and keep it nice. It's pretty evident if you drive through a neighborhood, it's pretty evident. A neighborhood, the minute you get there, I can look at 4 houses in a neighborhood and tell you whether there's an active HOA or not. And generally speaking, it's going to be because if there's an active HOA, there's not going to be like busted down or broke down cars, you know, sitting in people's driveways. There's not going to be fences leaning over, or, you know, fence posts, you know, busted out. Like, it's going to have a good curb appeal. And when, again, looking at this house from a resale value, having a good curb appeal is important. HOAs can be like a pain, right? Like you get these like picture letters on your door, and it's like, your trash can was still out of your house 24 hours after pickup. Do it again, it's a $50 fine. Like, it's annoying, but at the same time, I don't really want to have trash cans sitting out in front of all the neighbors' homes for the next 10 months. Like, that's also something I don't want to see. So I get that there's a purpose and a place for it. And I would say if you're looking at resale value and you're looking at being in a neighborhood, I would look for neighborhoods with an active HOA. As much as that's going to frustrate you sometimes because you want to paint your front door blue and they won't let you, there's trade-offs. As much as you like a new blue door, $90K more in equity over the next 4 years, that's a good price to pay for a blue door. So I think it's weighing out the pros and cons, but I'd refer it back to the idea that whatever home or situation you're buying into, as much as you want to enjoy it, you're inevitably buying that house for somebody else, and you're going to be selling it to somebody else soon. So making sure you're in an area where it's got good curb appeal, good appreciation, I think it is important. So I do like neighborhoods that have HOAs in that regard. Now, if you're in a neighborhood where it's like 1 acre, 2 acre lots, like old Austin neighborhoods where the homes are kind of built into the woods, you barely can even see the homes. It's got tons and tons of trees. There are some really cool neighborhoods like this in Austin. Jeff Frazier lives in one, just a beautiful neighborhood. We all grew up right next to it, and it's got 100-year oaks, and there's no HOA there, but everybody basically has like an acre lot, and it's kind of the look and feel of it. It's got that natural look, right? When you drive into a new neighborhood where there's new trees getting planted, there's no natural look there. So what you want is a clean look, right? So every neighborhood has its quirks and its values. And if you can find a good neighborhood that has maybe like a natural look to it, and they don't need an HOA to keep that natural look, then I think it's great. Your home's still going to appreciate rather aggressively. A lot of times, if you're in a neighborhood without an HOA, if it's going to appreciate aggressively, it's probably because it's a pretty expensive neighborhood with big lots. The smaller lot, less expensive neighborhoods without HOAs, they degrade more than improve. So I'd be mindful of those.
Excellent. And then that second HOA question, it's more of a broad question, but Helen asked, houses with no HOA fees versus condos with an HOA. What are your thoughts? How do you cover expenses without one, or how do you know that that the HOA fees will be properly allocated in covering expenses?
So I'm going to share a personal feeling here first. And this is only from a financial standpoint. unless you personally really enjoyed condos, I wouldn't get a condo. Condos are not going to appreciate at the same rate as a home, ever. And unless we're talking about skyscrapers downtown, which is a whole different thing. But now the HOA fees on those condos is like $1,000 a month. So let's not, I'm not even going to get into that world. I'm more talking about down to earth condos type of a scenario that condos are cheaper. And so they're very tempting as like an entry spot for a home. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit in line 3 and line 4, third key, fourth key. It's tempting sometimes to get into a home immediately and get into a cheaper home. But this is all about ROI. It's about enjoying where you live, first and foremost, and then making sure that you have a good ROI, a good return on your investment. And so sometimes staying in an apartment for another 6 months, making real good financial decisions over those 6 months, building up enough savings to then maybe be able to afford the down payment on a home as opposed to a condo. Sometimes that additional 6 months or 12 months renting and sacrificing is worth it. Now, it means you got to be somewhere for another 6 to 12 months renting, which sucks. But again, this is a long game. This isn't something where you're looking for a lottery ticket. It's a long game. So stepping into a home that maybe you have to wait 8 more months to get into or 12 more months to get into, but that home over the next 3 to 4 years that you're living in it appreciates 40 to 50K more than the condo. When you sell it, you're going to have 40 to 50K more. And so really you're living in an apartment for 8 months and you're making sacrifices for the 50K on the back end. And that's where you look at the ROI of that kind of a decision. So I think from an HOA standpoint with condos, they can get pretty steep, and that's money you're not going to get back out from an equity standpoint, right? When you sell your house, nobody refunds you your HOA over the last 4 years. So that's money you're burning. So getting into a good HOA, but a less expensive HOA, typically that's more of a home situation than a condo situation. I've seen some condos where it's pretty cheap, but then the HOA is maybe $100 or a couple $100 a month. And that adds up over a period of a year and can really offset some of the savings that you thought you had. So unless you're set on a condo because that's what you like and that's cool, like if my dad had his druthers, they would live in a condo or in a hotel. And like that's what he wants, right? He don't want to mow his lawn no more. He's done that. But my mom, she wants the house where the grandkids can come and play, right? Like there's an offset. So I get there's a draw to condos, but condos typically are not going to, a condo in the same neighborhood as a home is typically not going to appreciate at the same rate as the home. So making a 6 to 12 month sacrifice ahead of the time can pay huge, big 50, 60K dividends 3 to 4 years down the road. And I think it's probably worth the sacrifice.
Okay, one last question just popped in when you were wrapping up. Merle asked, have you looked into using FHA loans to purchase multifamily homes and renting out one or more units while also living in one of the units yourself? Just a general curious question.
I'll actually talk about something on that as I get into 3 and 4. That's a great question. And so let me kind of address that while I get into 3. So number 3 here on the keys for home buying is to make sure that we find balance. And I just talked about this a little bit with the condo. When you understand that you want to buy eventually, that's a decision that now you have to own. You've got to own that decision and recognize that in order to make that decision, you have to look at how you're approaching your finances. You've got to budget appropriately. You've got to start putting money aside. And you want to get in a good exchange rate. Okay. So the concept of an exchange rate is something that we're all probably familiar with because if you've ever traveled outside of the country, there's an exchange rate, right? You go to England and you hand them $1 and they give you like 80 cents. And you're like, hey man, you just stole 20 cents and that's exchange rate, right? You go down to Canada, you go up to Canada and you give them $1, they give you $1.50. And you're like, oh, okay, that one worked out good for me. Gotcha, son, right? Like that's the idea of an exchange rate is you hand the same person $1, they either return you $1.50 or they return you 80 cents. It's still the same dollar. It exchanges at a much different rate. We're very accustomed to this. And I talk a lot about exchange rates as it pertains to number 3, because the idea of number 3, right, is making sure that you get into a mortgage with a good exchange rate. You want to have all your ducks in a row so that you can step into the right mortgage. And sometimes that means you're going to have to make very real sacrifices. You've got to, vacation at Lake Travis and not Cancun for a year. Put money aside, because over time, as you own this house, the difference between getting a loan at like a 2.5% versus a loan at 3.5%, it's going to look big on a monthly basis, but it's going to be ginormous on a total cost of ownership. And if this house is eventually going to be leveraged as an asset, you want as much money as possible that you're paying on a monthly basis to go into principal as opposed to going towards interest. Principal that gets paid down on your mortgage loan, right? What you owe, when you make a payment, a percentage of it goes towards what you owe and a percentage of it goes towards the bank for lending you money. Your first couple of years of payments on a mortgage, it will make you nauseous to see how much money goes towards interest and not principal. It's crazy. It only gets crazier the higher the interest rate is. So big emphasis here on making sure that you find the right balance. Get out of renting as soon as you can, not as soon as you're able. So you want to get out of renting and eventually into home ownership, because then you own an asset that's appreciating. You get to leverage that asset over time for money for yourself, right? But if you drop everything right now and you say, okay, I'm going to get out of the apartment, I'm going to get into the home, I'm going to buy a home in the wrong neighborhood because it's cheaper, but it has this one amenity that I'm looking for, and my credit score is really not all that good right now, but I ain't got 6 months to wait, I got to buy, boom, jump in there, and you jump in to a home in the wrong neighborhood, right? Maybe with some amenities or the price that looks good, but now you're at an interest rate that's really not where you want to be. You're not going to turn on or flip on this house over the next year or two. This is a typically 2 to 4 or 2 to 5 year decision that now you have to live with. And you've got to live with it as it echoes throughout the rest of your financial life. You get the wrong house in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong rate. Every payment you make, you're paying down as little of principal as possible. It's appreciating as slowly as possible, right? And so although you got in there immediately and you stopped paying rent, right, 4 to 5 years from now, what you get on the back end of that is dramatically different than sometimes taking a breath, recognizing this is something that I want from myself. It's something that I want more than eating out. It's something that I want more than a new car. And you make those kind of decisions and you budget accordingly. Ramen noodles is good. Anybody who tells you otherwise is lying. Peanut butter and jellies are delicious. And it's very real that as you're trying to build long-term wealth for yourself, that the snowball effect, the snowball's very small initially. And it's going to feel like you're not making a lot of progress. But if you're willing to make the sacrifices, start that snowball off right, it can build momentum much faster if it's going downhill than if you're rolling it uphill. And I think a lot of the times we get so eager to get into something we feel we deserve or something that we have to have. We get into it and we want to start building our snowball. We just don't realize we're rolling it uphill instead of downhill. And so even though it might build, based on the rotations, the bigger it gets, the harder it is to actually get it to rotate. Whereas if you build the snowball right, and you start rolling it downhill, eventually it can have its own momentum and do a lot of that work for you. So looking here, I wanted to really highlight and just show, and this is probably something y'all have all tinkered with. You can go to mortgage calculators online if you ever get bored at night. This is much better than Netflix. These things can have a huge impact in your life. Taking the time, making the sacrifices so that you can put in a good down payment, right? And a good down payment should be starting out 5%. If you're getting into your first home, you want a 5% down payment. 5% down payment on a 30-year loan is going to allow you, right, to get into the most prime, close to prime oriented mortgage as you can. Right now, there's a lot of other, government programs out there. And if you can leverage any of those government programs, then by all means, but building a financial plan around a government program, the government programs can change. Maybe one day you're qualified. Maybe by the time you get there, you're not qualified. Maybe you don't even get accepted, right? The idea of sound decisions mean that they're sound regardless of any variables. And so when I talk about this is a variable free, like a vacuum free kind of a zone where it says like, you want to get into as close of prime mortgage as possible. Prime, right, is set by the government, right? It says, here's essentially the lending note. This is prime, right? And right now it's at close to 0%. Prime is as close to 0% as it's ever been, which is why mortgages are so crazy. Because banks are always going to build a mortgage based on that prime number plus like 2%. Right? Or 2-3%. But if you're risky, then they're going to build it based on like 3 or 4%. No different than when you're buying a car, right? No different than buying a car, because when you walk in and they look at your credit score, they're going to give you a car at 3% interest or give you that same car at 9% interest. It's still the same car, but it costs dramatically different for the two people who walk in and buy it based on the cost of that loan. So if you look at a house, for example, and 3 neighbors, I give this example all the time and I walk through. You're in a cul-de-sac, there's 3 neighbors, right? 3 neighbors in the cul-de-sac, and they always walk out and they're like, hi, Sarah, hi, John, a great neighborhood, we love it, right? They all then get in the same car and they drive to the same job. They all make the same exact salary. Those 3 people can have a extremely different financial situation based on how they leverage their money and their decisions for finances. Same house, same car, same job, same salary, completely different financial situation. I'll do a whole course on this just to show you how big this gets and how crazy it gets. I'll just use the house for an example though. 3 homes on a cul-de-sac, all for $350,000, right? All 30-year notes. One person walks in there, 5% down, great credit score. They get as close to prime percentage as possible. They get a 2.5% mortgage rate, and they're dancing. They're like, yeah, right? That person is going to be paying a monthly mortgage payment of $1,383 a month. And the total cost of ownership after 30 years and making all their payments, they've paid about $497,000 to buy a $350,000 home. Now their neighbor, same home, same car, same job, same salary, they didn't prepare, right? They didn't get into a standard or typical mortgage. They had to get into a little bit of a one-off mortgage. They had to pay an interest premium in order to do it, right? Maybe it was a variable interest, whatever it might be, but they're at 4.5%. Same house, same car, same job, same salary. But that family is paying $1,773 a month for the same house. So when you look at disposable income, those 2 neighbors who have the same exact world, over the next 3 to 4 years, that one neighbor's car gets upgraded. And the other neighbor's like, John, we work the same job and the same salary. How do you afford that house? Well, I'm paying $400 less a month for our home than you are. That adds up, right? Over a period of a couple of years, it's dramatic as it then gets into every other aspect of your life. But at 4.5%, right, you jump into a house, you really don't have a down payment, so you get into variable, you end up at 4.5%. Now you just paid $638,000 for your $350,000 home. So your payments, even though you might get out of it in the next 4 to 5 years, your payments were going more towards interest, less towards principal. So the equity that you have built up in your house is far less than your neighbor who's at 2.5%, which means your second home is going to be far less than your neighbor's second home, right? So it becomes an echo for the next 30, 40, 50 years, right? Where you either get to leverage it and benefit it going downhill, or you're working your tail off going uphill. But it's pretty dramatic. Same home, $400,000 a month difference in payments, just based on how you step in and the kind of mortgage that you get into. Any questions on that one, Shelby?
There were a few kind of questions around that topic. One person asked, say they're paying $500 more on their house payment to lessen the loan time, but would that be better served to pay off their car, then put that 500 back towards the principal of their mortgage?
Ooh, that's a good question. Really, it comes down to interest rates. So it's math is powerful. Calculus is not. And if anybody loves calculus, by all means, if anybody saw my LinkedIn, if anybody ever saw my LinkedIn, I like calculus. I just hate that they make calculus a requirement for every high school student who's never going to use calculus outside of maybe 1% of them. I think it should still be in schools, but maybe as an elective, right? Basic math where you're not using letters, but are using numbers, right? Basic math matters, right? It matters. So it all comes down to interest rates. If you're paying your car is at a 2% interest rate, but your home is at a 3% interest rate, then you should put your money towards your home because the interest is higher. You're paying, if you will, more in interest, and you want to start getting that paid down and get more into principal, then maybe a car that's at a 2% interest, it's cheaper money. You might as well not be in so much of a hurry to kind of pay that off. Now that's the simple high level answer. Obviously, based on a number of variables beneath it that may adjust, but I would go strictly mathematics. If you're ever going to make an extra payment towards something and you're trying to decide between your house and your car, just see what your interest rates are, pay off the highest interest rate.
One kind of in that same vein, somebody said, does it make sense to go from a $1,500 a month rental to a $750 per month mobile home loan? May not be building great value, but able to save $750 a month towards a future down payment on a real home.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the time for paying it and what interest rates you can get on it, I think any kind of decisions or any sacrifices that you make for yourself, and like I make sacrifices even today. So 15 years, 20 years later, and building financial independence and financial wealth, there's still sacrifices. Some of the poorest people I know are some of the richest people. They have like the nicest home and they can't afford it. And they're 3 steps away from bankruptcy because of the decisions they made, or they never have disposable income or whatever, right? Like the idea is if you want to get ahead, you have to sacrifice. Like that is inevitable. You have to be able to sacrifice things and invest. And so if going from an apartment at $1,500 or $1,500 a month that you have no return on, all you do is get a roof over your head. When you pay that apartment complex, you might as well burn the money. That's how I feel. That's how I felt for a year when I was paying for the office space here, by the way. I know what you're talking about. You're just burning the money. You get no back end value to that. So if you get a mobile home and you're able to cut your expense from $1,500 to $750, put $750 into a savings account so that over the next year you earn $8,000, $9,000, and now you can leverage that towards a 5% standard mortgage and get into a home. The home's going to appreciate much faster than your mobile home. In fact, a lot of mobile homes, depending on how you treat it, may even depreciate. However, $750 a month cheaper, it would have to depreciate at a faster rate than $8,000 a year, or more importantly, the $1,500 that you're spending on your rent that's essentially getting burned, right? It would have to appreciate at a faster rate than $15,000 a year to offset that, and typically it won't appreciate at that rate as long as you take care of it. So yeah, I mean, I would say at face value, any sacrifices you can make to put money away and to get yourself into a stronger position, into a better position down the road, I think those sacrifices are worth it. Okay, I don't mean to harp on that, but like I firmly and truly believe in that principle more than I could ever explain to anyone. Like if you're willing to sacrifice, then you'll get ahead. If you're not willing to sacrifice, you're never going to get ahead. It doesn't matter how much money you make. We see this every day. There's 300 employees in this company. And I bet if you ask some of your leaders, They probably had more money in the bank when they were making less than they do now. You typically fill up the house no matter how big the house is. You typically spend the bank account no matter how big the bank account is until you learn how to make sacrifices and essentially to separate what you want from what you need. So if you can make a sacrifice like that, and that's a sacrifice you're willing to make, I think you can turn that into a good financial sense and flip it into a house, 18 to 24 months from now, and really allow that house to then start, accelerating your financial, position. So very quickly, going into step 4, I know we're running short on time, and I want to get it. The idea here is, how do you stay in your lane, right? And this is leveraging home 1 to get into home 2 to get into home 3. And this is building a snowball that's going downhill, not uphill. And I want to give you a visual to this real quick, because it's crazy, right? But stepping into a right home in the right neighborhood that appreciates appropriately, that $350,000 house, if you can get that house into a good neighborhood where you can appreciate it and get equity enough, the difference here on your next home, maybe you get into a nicer home, a $500,000 home, but if you have the equity to put 5% down versus 20% down versus 50% down, it is a dramatic impact. Not a little impact, it's a dramatic impact. So if you get a $500,000 home and you put 5% down, right, you essentially need a loan for $475,000. You get that at 3.5%, your monthly payment's $2,100. But if you can get a house in the right area, get a good mortgage, put more of that money towards principal as opposed to interest, allow the house to appreciate while you're paying down the principal, and you can sell that house and then get yourself into a $500,000 house, and you can actually build up enough of like $250,000 equity, which in the city of Austin is not crazy, somewhere around that. If you can get into there and you put all that equity, roll that equity into that $500,000 house, your loan now is $250,000. Maybe at $250,000, you can even get more aggressive on your term and do a 15-year as opposed to a 30-year. Now you're at 1.5% on a mortgage interest, maybe 1.7, wherever you end up. Now your monthly payment is $1,500, and your total cost of ownership is, you will eventually pay $279,000 on that loan, whereas home 1 will pay $767,000 on the loan. That is a $500,000 difference in your second home or your third home because you made the right decisions on your first and your second home, building the equity, let that snowball roll down the hill. That same cul-de-sac family, right, that made those kind of decisions, the ones who made first home decisions were eventually able to leverage that to get into a second or a third home where they're putting 50% down in equity. They're in a 15-year mortgage. Their monthly payment is now a fraction. They're in the nicer home, and the cost of ownership is going to be a fraction of what it is for someone else. And the idea then is now they have more disposable income, which is why you probably see them traveling more on Instagram, why they might have a boat parked in their garage, and you're wondering, how in the heck is that possible when we're making the same money? It's because they're rolling the snowball down the hill, you're rolling the snowball up the hill. It's a dramatic kind of impact. The last thing I wanted to talk about is just some other expenses or maybe some terms you're going to hear as you step into home buying. Mortgage, this is essentially the loan that you get from the bank. And when you make a mortgage payment, you're paying principal plus interest. We talked about that a little bit. Now, if you don't put 20% down on your house, you have to pay a mortgage insurance or a mortgage interest. Mortgage insurance sucks. There's no other way around it. You burn $100 to $200 a month for the privilege of taking out the loan. This is an insurance policy that the bank takes out on your house in case you run away on your loan or you default on your loan. They now have this insurance to cover up to, essentially up to that 20% gap where if there's a depreciation or if they have to fix up their home, they're now covered on their loan. So the minute you get to 20% of your home's equity, right? Not 20% of your loan, but 20% of your home equity, you can always refinance your loan to get there. Once you get to 20%, you then lose the mortgage insurance, and the mortgage insurance goes away, and you just earned $100 to $200 a month, depending on your loan. Then now you get to put back in your pocket that you were burning in a fire. So if you make additional payments, if you can make additional payments on principal to get to 20% faster, you can eliminate mortgage insurance from your expenses, which is oftentimes $100 to $200 a month. The next thing is escrow, and you're going to hear a lot about escrow, right? You're buying a house. Escrow is essentially the home insurance, not mortgage insurance, the home insurance on your home. Like if it burns down, you have insurance on it, like you have insurance on your car. And then your property taxes, which in the state of Texas they're expensive. We don't have personal income tax, which, thank goodness for that. But we do have property tax. And so when you pay into your escrow on a monthly basis, that essentially is going into a trust fund so that at the end of the year, you can pay your taxes off, and that throughout the year, they can pay for your insurance. Just like when you buy a new car at the bank, they force you to have car insurance. The bank's no different on a home. They make you have home insurance, so they roll that insurance payment into the escrow so they know that it's being made. So if you make an extra payment on your mortgage, that's not going to impact your escrow. It's not going to impact your mortgage insurance, right? Those are still going to occur until you get to 20% of your home value, and then your mortgage insurance goes away. And the escrow is there in essence until you're dead, right? Like even if you pay off your house, you still have to have some level of a tax payment. Maybe you don't put it into an escrow account, but you're still, every year, you're going to get property taxes from the state. So you never really own your house, if you will. You might own your house, but you don't own the land that it sits on, and you got to pay taxes on it. So that doesn't go away. And then the last thing, I know we're 1 minute over, but the last thing is the big value of having a home versus like renting an apartment or things of that nature is now you get to also file a homestead exemption, which benefits your tax hit and your tax burden. You want to make sure that the home that you're in, that you filed for a homestead exemption. Go get your homestead exemption right now. In the state of Texas, you're allowed to have a homestead exemption on one home, the home that you live in from a primary standpoint. Get your homestead exemption, lower your taxes as much as possible, so that money can then go into your life and into your future. Now, we'll take the next 3 minutes just in case there are any questions on those. I kind of fired through 4 and 5, but there's some information there. Again, this video, this was being recorded. I'm going to post it up onto my YouTube. Anybody feel free to grab it, ask questions from there as well. There's going to be a comment section on the YouTube. Feel free. I'll interact with you guys. This is just something that I do to try to help out. Like it's a notion where I've seen great physical, great mental health coming from financial health. There's real cool principles that you can tie to, and you can leverage this. Like there are 3 neighbors living simultaneous lives who are using money differently. And 20 years from now, they're not going to be neighbors, and their situations are going to be dramatically different. I want to make sure that you are on the upside of that dramatic difference. I want to make sure that you're rolling your snowball down the hill. That's the goal. So anything I can do to help out with that, I'm going to post this, ask comments, rewatch it. You got the everything and anything in between. Ask comments. If there's ever anything I can do to help you out on this, please. I want to be any kind of a resource that I can be and help out where I might. Cool.